World Health Day, 7th of April 2011. Dr. Margaret Chan, then Director General of the World Health Organization, addressed the world with an alarming message. In the face of inaction, the world is heading towards a post-antibiotic era, and that no action today means no cure tomorrow. In the 10 years since Dr. Chan's statement, 7 million across the world have died from drug-resistant diseases, and by 2050, we could see this rise to 10 million a year. That's one person every 3 seconds. The question is, how did we get to this point? And how does the way we eat affect this silent pandemic? Antibiotics have been used for centuries to treat infections. Their use can be traced back to the ancient Egyptians, who used mouldy bread to treat infected wounds. However, our modern antibiotic era started in 1928 when Alexander Fleming stumbled upon the discovery of the antibiotic penicillin. Fleming's haphazard discovery set the wheels in motion for today's antibiotic abundance, and by the 1940s, penicillin was widely used to treat Allied troops in World War II, heralded a miracle drug. The following decades were known as the golden era for antibiotics, and the mass production of these drugs enabled us to treat diseases such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and typhoid, and undeniably improve and save the lives of millions. But with the abundance of antibiotics has come the dangerous reality of antibiotic resistance, a bacteria's ability to thrive despite the use of a drug, rendering it completely useless. This has stemmed mainly from the overuse and misuse by humans, but resistance is also coming from another source: intensive farming.
Like humans, animals can get bacterial infections as well, so antibiotics are to treat infections caused by bacteria. But there are quite a few other ways that antibiotics are used in livestock farming, which we tend to think of as the problematic uses. So one of the ways that antibiotics are used are sort of as an insurance policy to stop disease in the first place. So where animals live in quite stressful, cramped, overcrowded conditions, they're given antibiotics at low levels precautionarily to basically keep them alive until slaughter weights. Another reason farm animals are given antibiotics is to improve their rates of growth. So it's a side effect of antibiotics that animals do grow faster when they're on a course of antibiotics.
These profit-driven, non-clinical uses of antibiotics are known as subtherapeutic doses. They are a hallmark of intensive animal agriculture, with the trend for their use beginning in the 1950s. Whilst growth-promoting antibiotics are banned in the EU and US, they're still legal in other parts of the world. And in many countries, including the UK, antibiotics are still permitted as a preventative measure.
So the subtherapeutic use of antibiotics is really what is spurring on the increased rates of resistance that bacteria are developing to antibiotics. So it's where the sort of natural selection comes in. So this low-level use of antibiotics is essentially allowing the stronger bacteria to survive, and they then breed and they multiply, and that's what becomes what we know as superbugs. If you had a clinically diagnosed disease and you used a strong, properly dosed course of antibiotics to treat it, you're more likely to be able to kill off those stronger bacteria. So it really is survival of the fittest.
Today, it's estimated that 2/3 of global antibiotics go to our livestock, with the use of these drugs for farm animals rising to 104,000 tonnes by 2030. We are dealing with enormous volumes of antibiotics for livestock, and with huge volumes of antibiotics being used irresponsibly, we are creating a global breeding ground for resistance to jump to humans.
There is definitely a link between the use of antibiotics in farming and rates of resistance in humans. There are decades of research behind it already that have proven the link between the overuse in livestock and rates of antimicrobial resistance in humans.
Antibiotic-resistant bacteria can spread from animals to humans, either via direct contact, through the food chain, or even through the environment, as resistant bacteria can survive in animal waste and seep into water supplies. And sadly, we have already seen examples of resistant bacteria originating from intensive animal agriculture. Back in 2015, Cases of resistance to a last resort antibiotic for humans, colistin, were found in multiple countries, and it's widely understood by scientists to have come from intensive pig farming. While efforts are being made to tackle this problem by the global health community, and there are many examples of ethical, responsible farming across the globe, concern is still mounting about emerging trends with our growing appetite for meat.
We still see projections for meat consumption just skyrocketing over the next couple of decades, and with that anticipating quite an increased level of antibiotic use in livestock, because the systems that are going to be used and the types of farming that are going to meet this increased demand are going to be the types of system where they're more conducive to disease than they are for health. So it's almost like the use of antibiotics at these long-term low levels are being written into the blueprints of meeting the increased demand for animal proteins. I mean, we really are setting up the most perfect breeding ground for superbugs, and we're intending as a species to breed more and more of these genetic monocultured animals and to keep them in conditions that are really conducive for disease outbreaks.
By 2050, without collective change, the world could be faced with drug-resistant infections, which would cause an economic fallout on par with the 2008 financial crash. Governments and societies are at an important crossroad, with an opportunity to decide how we want to feed ourselves over the coming decades, and the types of systems we want to use. And the first step is in facing our lack of data and wildly different levels of regulation.
The way antibiotics are used in livestock is regulated so differently across the world. Not only is how they're used is regulated differently, how they're licensed, how they're sold, how they're prescribed, and how they're distributed. There is no commonality across the globe, and some countries use far more than other countries without necessarily producing much more in terms of meat. One of the biggest global challenges with antimicrobial resistance is a lack of data, and it's a lack of good, harmonised and publicly available data, because in most countries we don't even know how many antibiotics are being used for which species. I mean, in some countries it is so unregulated that you can buy antibiotics over the counter and use them in any species at any volume you like, and there aren't really any tangible repercussions for doing that. But a lot of how the global meat industry works is secretive and is not going to give up its data easily, and that is one of the biggest challenges we've got on the livestock side. But it's a hard one to pin down because it's not just coming from one place, but there are things that we could do now as a society, as a global community, to try and really put the brakes on it as individuals, buying better meat, buying less meat, and using your sort of citizen voice as much as you can to say you want change, you want better farming systems, you want more responsible procurement of meat into this country from other nations. That's the kind of thing that we can be focusing on quite proactively now.
10 years have passed from Dr. Chan's WHO statement, and in that time, the world has been devastated by a pandemic widely thought to have stemmed from animals. Antibiotic resistance is our silent pandemic, a dangerous add-on to our cheap meat fix, and a common characteristic of intensive farms. But with global cooperation, taking a One Health approach in regulating and reducing our use of non-clinical antibiotics in our livestock, we can curb the threat of future pandemics from livestock and quit farming animals.